Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Incom Gaming, Cheltenham's premier friendly local game store. Check the link in the description. With Warhammer the Old World finally launching on the 20th of January 2024, by the time you're watching this, most people will have their hands on their rulebooks, and if like me, you've been delving deep into all the content for those that had early access over the last couple of weeks, looking at the reviews for the rules and the army lists, there are a few things that may well have piqued your attention, and for me it was the Bombard from the Bretonnian Arcane Journal. With Bombards being missing from the Bretonnian army list since the early days, the new Bretonnian Exiles alternative list allows the Border Princes Bombard to make its return for those less than honourable Bretonnian lords. Of course, with the original miniatures being so old, I don't think we're going to see them return to the range anytime soon, and the rulebook suggests using something like the Empire Great Cannon. Now that's obviously a perfectly good idea, but if we look at pictures of Bombards, they look a little bit different to cannon to me. Here's one I saw last summer on holiday in Ghent, obviously minus the wheels, but I just don't think the Empire Cannon's quite going to cut it for me. But scouring the new Games Workshop ranges, I think I might have found something I can work from the Age of Sigmar Cities of Sigmar range. My name's Stuart, welcome to Miniature Realms, and in this video I'm going to show you how I kitbash and paint a Bretonnian Bombard. Before we crack on with the painting, let's talk about today's video sponsor, Into the AM. They sent me a lovely selection of basic tees and graphic tees to have a look at. They came really quickly and the quality seems absolutely fantastic. They've been around since 2012 and the t-shirts are handcrafted with care by a team of skilled artisans using quality fabrics and eco-friendly inks. There's a huge range of designs for t-shirts on the website and a number of other items of clothing as well. You can even change the website to your local currency. Don't forget to check their bundle deals as well. I really like the basic tee packs. They're very smart and tidy shirts with a very simple logo on the left breast. The fit's really great, even for someone with a post-athletic physique as mine is. The graphic tees come in a range of awesome colourful designs. My wife ended up ordering me this one after she saw me looking on the website and not realising it was going to feature in an advert. This was one of my favourite designs and I think I'll be heading back and having a look at some more. But I think for now, this is my favourite. Check out the link in the description. Use the code Miniature Realms for 10% off. Now a quick look at the sprue images show if you ignore the big shields on the front, what's left underneath is pretty promising. And referring back to those online reviews, I can pause and zoom in and see that I need a 50mm base and an extra crew member, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Now, I didn't have any 50mm bases knocking around, and me being impatient, I decided to print one. So with my own world cannon in hand, I've decided I'm going to use the two existing crew with a few little minor adjustments, and I've grabbed my bag of extra bits left over from all my Bretonnian collecting this year. I know I've got a couple of extra men-at-arms in there and I can build my third crew member from those. I grabbed a few extra bits as well, so spare heads from men-at-arms to make the crew look much more Bretonnian rather than Cities of Sigmar, as well as a few of the other little knickknacks as well. You've got birds in bags and hammers and pouches and things, all to make them fit in with the Bretonnian army even more. So first off, it was time to get the Ironweld Great Cannon built, and I realised I wasn't going to use many of the options there. So I had a quick flick through, worked out which bits I needed to leave off on the guide. It didn't take too long to have the base of the cannon built without those big shields on the front and leaving quite a few of the other little extras off. It looks like a pretty standard cannon there really, but with smaller wheels and that longer cylindrical barrel which gives it that Bombard style look which I was after. A little gap filling tip here: once you've glued two sides of a miniature together and you very gently rub a file over the two joints, it doesn't work in all parts of the model obviously, but something like a cannon barrel like this, you can just smooth over that gap without needing any putty. All of the scrapings and the filings seem to just fill out the gap and blend it together nicely, and once you've primed it you can't see the line at all. I've already trimmed off lots of bits that didn't really fit with the aesthetic, and as I got to this stage I realised that the two bottom supports for the shield weren't needed either, so I cut them off and set about tidying that area up. A quick file and a little bit of glue and then a wooden mallet hammer glued in place, and that just fills that space nicely. I grabbed one of the halberd arms from my bits of spares and decided I was going to turn this into a sponge for the cannon. The cannon has these semi-cylindrical shells with a rounded end, so I just trimmed one of those off, cut off the ball end and filed it down before drilling a hole for which to glue the shaft from the halberd into. Afterwards, a quick spot of glue and you're able to glue that halberd shaft in, and you've got quite a nice strong fit there rather than just gluing it gently on top, and you have something that looks almost exactly like a cannon sponge would do. Then, with the opposite of what I did for the sponge, I actually trimmed the ball ends off of all of the others, and I was going to place a few on the base to represent the cannonballs. You only get 2 crew in the box for the iron-welded cannon, so I'm using one of the men-at-arms as I said I would earlier in the video. So I picked my body, picked the head. I found one with a lovely big wide handlebar moustache, and I'll come back to that a little bit later, but I wanted him to be a cheeky chappy, maybe reminiscent somewhat of this guy. So when it came to building the other 2 crew, I really wanted to keep a female crew person, and the men-at-arms kit only has male heads. So I trimmed the top off the female head from the iron-welded cannon, and I'm going to trim the head part off a helmeted head from the men-at-arms, and then stick that on the other side so it looks like she's wearing the same head, and then tying her in with the rest of the army. In order to get her head to fit in nicely, I had to Dremel out a hole just to make it fit in snug, so it looked like she was wearing it rather than it was balanced on the top of the head. But a quick dab of glue afterwards and we were all done. Adding other small bits from those Bretonnia men-at-arms kits really helps tie in these Age of Sigmar models essentially into the rest of the army and make them look much more in line with the Bretonnians. And it was a similar case for the other crew member, the big lumbering chap here. Just popping a Bretonnian head on him just really tied him all in. The uniforms that they're wearing are fairly generic fantasy, so it doesn't take much of a stretch of imagination once you've added a few Bretonnian bits here and there to really make this fit in with the army's theme. And there they all are ready for priming. Now the scale is slightly bigger on some of the Age of Sigmar miniatures, but I quite like the idea that he's the father of these 2 lunking children, and while he's only of small stature himself, his wife on the other hand was a rather tall lady producing these chunky tall kids. After priming the miniatures back, I cracked out my airbrush and some bold titanium white from Pro Acryl and set to work underpainting the miniatures. It's a bit more than a zenithal because I go from more than one angle, and I finish off with a dry brush of white as well, really picking out that detail, and this really helps when I base coat with contrast style paints. When you're applying those glazes over the top, it produces you a really nice roadmap, a really nice idea of where to apply later highlights, and if you so wish you can leave the miniatures as they are and just let the contrast paints do their effect. It really is the best of both worlds. So I started with the wood, and I'm using contrast Militarum green, some wildwood, some Cygor brown and some Gore Grunter fir. These have all been thinned 50-50 with water, so they're quite thin and quite watery. The idea is I'm going to do a lot of wet blending and mixing together on the model itself, and because they're so watery it really runs into the grains nicely. You get this fantastic pre-highlighted effect. Now I don't do this with all contrast paints, I often go a little bit thicker, but I use this method on the trebuchet, so if you've already seen that tutorial, we'll be familiar with it. If you haven't and you want to see it in a little bit more detail, I do cover it there as well. But sticking to the wood areas as much as I can, trying to keep the paint off other areas where possible. It doesn't really matter if it's going to be metallic, but things like those ropes, and I really want to keep them cleaner, so when I apply contrast paints later on, I can really get the best benefit from those underpainting techniques. There's quite a lot of wooden areas on this miniature, so it's worth taking your time to go all the way around and just have some fun with it. It is loads of fun using these different colours and mixing them and blending them together, and the effects that it produces is really pleasing, which is always nice when you're painting, when you can see that immediate effect and know that it's going right. Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Baron of Dice, premium wargaming dice. Over 500 styles, over 4,000 customer reviews. Welcome to the best dice on the planet. For the ropes on the cannon, I use the Skeleton Horde, and that straight over those nice white areas really produces a finish that's almost ready to go without any work afterwards. But at this stage I grabbed some Deckhand from Model Colour for a bit of an all-over dry brush so I could catch the rope a little bit, but more importantly pick out all of that wood grain. Now, I'm doing this before I paint in any metallic areas because it means I can be really rough and it doesn't matter where I brush. For my base metallics, I've turned to Scale Colour Decayed Metal from Scale 75. This is the base for a lot of the metallics I do, and you'll have seen them before on the channel if you've watched previous tutorials. It's almost my go-to method. It's a lovely, deep, dark, bronzish colour, and it's perfect for plating underneath silvery metals because it makes them look a little bit older and dirtier and more weathered, which is the effect I'm really after with this cannon. Now, there's obviously an awful lot of metal on this machine, so it's worth taking your time to pick it out. You don't want to go over any of the nice wood effect that you've already finished on the miniature. After that, I grabbed the Black Lotus from Vallejo Express Colour, which is their own range of contrast style paints, and just use it to do the feathers on the bird. And there's also one on one of the crew members as well. This has a lovely blue tone to it, so it kind of gives you this really nice recessed shading with a slight blue tone, which is perfect for feathers. Now that that decayed metal is dry, it's time to turn to black metal from the same scale colour range, and this I paint almost entirely over the decayed metal, that brownish metallic we've already used, but just leaving little patches showing here or there. You just get that nice effect I was talking about earlier, where the metal looks a little bit old and dirty and easy to enhance those oil washes we're going to apply a little bit later on. While those paints are on my palette, I took the opportunity to use them on the weaponry and the helmets of the crew. The method is much the same, so the decayed metal, the browner colour first, followed up by the heavy metal afterwards. For the top highlight in those metallic areas, I'm turning to Game Air Silver, which is dry brush for the most part on the larger areas of the barrel of the cannon or bombard. But I do crack out the smaller brush to pick out some small edges and some bolts and things here and there, where if I dry brushed here, I'd risk getting metallic paints on areas I didn't want it. And of course, those techniques carry over to the crew members as well, just as they did for the earlier stages. For the head bombardier's sword hilt and pommel, I'm using some Necro Gold here from the same scale colour / scale 75 range. It's a really nice desaturated gold which doubles up very nicely as a kind of dull brass if you want it to as well. It's also really handy as a base layer over some decayed metal for this aiming device or sighting device, which I assume that this lady is holding here. So we now are heading to some oil washes, and this is a ready mixed oil wash from Soilworks, also from Scale Colour range, and this is grease. Now, oil washes are absolutely fantastic. They work very differently to standard GW washes. They don't pull as much on flat areas, and afterwards they take a long time to dry, so you can clean them off the flat areas, meaning you hide away those pooling. And when it does dry, it looks a little bit more like dirt and grime in all the recesses as well, so there's lots of wins there. Now, oils are a little bit different, as I've already mentioned. You need to use different brushes if you haven't used them before, and I haven't varnished this model, so I am being careful. I'm not slapping too much on. They do contain white spirits and it could break down the paintwork. And much like the other stages, I'm using them on the helmets and metal areas of the crew as well. It just gives this perfect weathered metal look, which keeps the shine from the highest highlights, but really just ties it all in, and I much prefer this than using something like a Nuln Oil or an Agrex Earth Shade. Now comes the next stage, which is Artist White Spirit, and again, you don't have to do this stage. You could just leave it as they've dried. As you can see, the oil paint is dried quite nicely on the miniature, but I would just use a little bit of clean Artist White Spirit on the end of a cotton bud or Q-tip if you're from stateside, and just take it off the flat surfaces and dab it on. You can remove where that oil paint has pulled, adding that brighter shine back on as well. For smaller areas, you can just use a clean brush as well, just to take any pooling off. And if you do take too much off, you can just pop it back on again. And oil paints can take, 24, 48 hours or even longer to fully dry and set. So you've got a little bit of time to go back. Even if you get interrupted halfway through, you can't really mess it up. The theme colours for my Bretonnian army are blue and yellow, and here I'm using Nazdrag yellow contrast paint just to pick out the few areas that are coloured on these miniatures. These are lowly, non-knightly characters, so they're not wearing too much in the way of livery, but you've got little shields and badges in certain areas. So there's one on the bombard itself and a couple on the uniform of the lead bombardier here. The base colour for my blue is from Vallejo Express Colour, and it's called Omega Blue, and it's a really nice, rich, vibrant blue that does a nice level base coat, even for a contrast style paint. So just taking my time here, especially down that centre line, when I'm going to make sure that we don't go over the yellow and keep it quite neat. Now it's time to focus on the crew a little bit and the skin, and here we're using Dwarf Skin, Gloomy Violet and Deep Purple from Vallejo Express Colour range. First off, we start with the dwarf's skin, and that's just straight out of the bottle and painted on directly over any areas where you require skin, and this is where that underpainting really comes in, and it needs to be light enough so that it settles in all the recesses, giving you a natural shade and shadow there, but the lightest, most highest point areas almost look like they're already highlighted. And I find that out of all the skin colours that are contrast style, be that Army Painter, Speed Paint or Citadel Contrast, or these newer Express Colour from Vallejo, this is currently my favourite one, and it seems to do that job fantastically. The next stage is the Gloomy Violet, which I like to use where there would be shadow, so mostly around where the skin meets clothing. So you've got a little bit of shadow around that cuff there. It just adds a little bit of tonal definition and really makes the skin look more three-dimensional. Then to finish off, we're using the Deep Purple, which is the redder tone of the few, and it really kind of adds some warmth and life to the skin. So I like to focus it around the nose, around the lips and the mouth, sometimes the cheeks, and a little bit on the knuckles as well. It just gives a really nice effect using those three glaze type colours, and you end up with a finish that you could leave as it is, even though I will go back and do a little bit of highlighting on top later on. So here I'm using a 50-50 mix of Templar white and medium, and I find that it's a really nice way of producing white, and you have to go over a paint that's almost completely white. So the underpainting here on these raised areas is almost like a pure white prime. There is a little bit of shadow built in, but not an awful lot in these top areas, and that's the way you get the best effect from these kind of contrast style whites. Now Apothecary White from Citadel is really good as well, slightly different tone to this, but I do like and use them both. But the idea, you want to have a fairly thin glaze with just a small amount settling in the recesses, and when it dries, it's those areas that look grey, which essentially gives you your shade. You're almost shading here rather than glazing. So we return now to Citadel Contrast Garagak Sewer. It's the colour we used on that small satchel that was on the Bombard's frame earlier on, and it is very often my go-to for leathers and brown clothing. There's quite a lot of it on these guys here. So there's nice big leather apron here, and his sister or compatriot also has a good sort of leather tunic or over tunic or something like that as well, and I also use that colour extensively there. So this chap's robes are almost monk-like, so I'm going to be using the hardened leather from Army Painter Speed Paint, and it gives the perfect colour for this classic-like robes that he's wearing. But I also end up using the same colour on the gaiters of both the other crew members. I turn to Citadel Contrast Basilicanium Grey for the base colour for all of the trousers for the crew. I find this paint can pull a little bit funny compared to some of the others, so I spend a little bit of time just blending it out and making sure that the finish is quite smooth so I don't get left with too many streaks afterwards. Use the same colour to paint in the cheeky chappie's moustaches as well. Black Legion is the perfect colour for the sponge for this chap's holding, but also for the boots of all three crew members as well. Now I turn to contrast Cygor brown with this nice different tone reddish darker brown, which is perfect when you've got lots of different browns on a miniature, and I'm using this for all the remaining leather areas on the crew. So we're looking at belts and gloves and things like that. Model colour orange, brown and light brown are used to highlight the lighter reddish brown areas, so this cassock style robes that the lead bombardier has here. Pretty standard layering style painting here, so the mid-tone that you've added with the orange brown, filling in some of those higher areas, and then some lighter, finer and thinner lines in the light brown afterwards, just to make it pop a little bit more. Exactly the same method to use on the gaiters on the other crew members as well. Sticking with model colour, we have flat earth and tan earth, and these are the perfect highlighting combo for those Garagax Earthshade layers. So again, very traditional layering style painting, neat thin lines, leaving the darker areas underneath, building up on the detail that's on the miniature, just to really raise certain areas, make them look lighter and make it pop, working your way up to the lightest colour for the finest lines, almost like edge highlighting. You can even add some fine lines like little dinks and scratches on the leather apron as well, and then carry over exactly the same techniques to the other crew member and the leather sort of tabard style jerkin top that she's got over the top of her shirt. I even used the same tan earth to add a little bit of highlight to the wooden mallet at the back of this crew member. For the final duo highlights for brown, we got saddle brown and German pale brown also from model colour as well, and they just highlight up that Cygor brown based colour we worked on earlier. So you're focusing on those raised areas and the detail of the miniature, the knuckles and things on the hands, the top edges of belts and so on. You don't have to do these extra highlights, of course, when you're painting with contrast paints. You get a nice looking miniature ready for the tabletop anyway, but I just think it really shows here that you can paint very traditionally after basing in that way, and you've really got that natural roadmap, that guidance that underpainting and using contrast glazes really gives you, and just adding these couple of highlights on top to areas like this really add a very nice finish to the miniature. Staying with model colour yet again, I've got London Grey and Light Grey to start with, a 50-50 mix of both of those two colours for the first highlight on all of their trousers and breeches. Following up with just a straight light grey for some thin edge highlights really to make it pop. Now turning to Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White, and I'm going to use this for highlighting all of their shirts, but first I'm just adding a few thin highlights to this chap's lovely moustaches. Less is more when highlighting the whites. I'm trying to make sure I leave some of the residual colours underneath as well. They're almost grey, but when you add a few thin white highlights here and there, it really just makes a difference. I'm also taking the opportunity to add a few more bits of underpainting to this drinking vessel here, so when I cover it in some contrast paint a little bit later on, we don't need to add any further highlights. I really am concentrating here on just picking out some very faint highlights, focusing on where the miniature has detail for raised areas of fabrics and things like that. You can also focus on the edges of areas like the cuff there, so that you accentuate the shadow from the area surrounding it. To highlight those spot yellow colours, I'm using Avalanche Sunset and Phalanx Yellow from Citadel. Now what I'm doing here is focusing to start with around the edges of the shield design, leaving a little bit darker in the centre, and then you're going to pick which you want to be brighter, top or bottom. It doesn't really matter, I like to mix it up a little bit, so for this one I'm going lighter at the top. So you start with the Avalanche Sunset, focusing around the edges, a little bit at the top, then you use that Phalanx Yellow to really make it pop for a thinner edge highlight down the centre around the edge, and a lighter colour in whichever top or bottom, whatever you choose, and it really just gives you this nice transition between the dark and the bright yellow. To highlight the blue, I'm using Royal Blue from Model Colour and a Marth Blue from the Scale Colour or Scale 75 Fantasy Games range, and I'm doing the same techniques as I did for the yellow side. So we're going in around the edge mostly first and then usually picking top or the bottom. I think here I decided to pick the bottom rather than the top that's on the yellow. No real change, no real difference, just because I wanted to and I thought that looked right at the time. We've got a little bit of gold to highlight, and for that I'm using Elven Gold from the Scale Colour range, same as the other metallics. I'm just picking out some of the top areas on this ranging device. Some contrast Agoras dunes gives a really nice pleasing effect over that underpainted drinking vessel. I don't know if it's pottery or earthenware or something like that, but because we've spent a little bit of time just putting some lighter highlights on there already, this just needs the single coat and I think it looks pretty good. Now I did say I would return to the flesh, and here we do with natural flesh and fairy flesh from the Noctura range from Vallejo. I really am just adding the smallest of highlights, just accentuating where you've got that natural highlight showing through from that glazed stage earlier on. I don't want to obliterate all the work I did with adding those different colour glazes, so I'm trying to be careful here, but if I do find I add a little bit too much brightness, I can always knock it back with a further glaze. The fairy flesh is a real top highlight, really is just the odd little dot here and there just to really make it pop. Using a touch of contrast Blood Angels red and Iyandan yellow, I'm just able to add a little bit of colour to represent a flame beneath that smoke patch, ready for her to light the blowhole on the Bombard cannon. And all in all, I'm pretty happy with the way it's come out. Considering it started life as an Age of Sigmar model with all the extra bits and stylisation that game has grown into over the years, I think underneath those shields and all those little extra bits, we got something that is very much generic fantasy. Swap out the heads for those from the Bretonnia Men-at-Arms kits, or at least the top of the head, the hat for the female crew member, and things look pretty good. Add in those little extras like the mallets with the shields from the Men-at-Arms kits as well, and of course a Men-at-Arms with that converted cannon sponge as well, and I think it looks pretty good. It looks like a kit that maybe you could have bought, and at least I'm happy with it in my army anyway. Be really interested to hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below. Do you think it's come out all right? Maybe you don't like the use of the Age of Sigmar miniatures. I know some people won't. I'm pretty happy, as I've already said, about the way it comes out. The crew look pretty good. I especially like the old Bretonnia Men-at-Arms guy with the big tashes and the big chap drinking his way through. The other one looks a little bit weird from the pictures. It's quite hard because she's in an action pose there that looks like she should be sort of lighting the touch hole, and she doesn't photograph very well like that. But all in all, I'm pretty happy. I'm excited to try out the Border Princes Bretonnian list. I think that's going to be really exciting. I'm looking forward to picking up my books soon as we get closer to launch weekend and writing some army lists for them. And I'd also love to hear what plans you guys have for the weekend. Are you collecting your armies? Maybe the weekend has already gone and you're watching this afterwards and you've already got your armies, your books and things. Let me know what you're doing for the old world in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Furthermore, in relation to that, the channel does have a Discord, so do go and check out the link in the video description. It's absolutely free to join. There are some areas that are hidden behind a paywall for my patrons, but the vast majority of the Discord is absolutely free and encourage some really friendly hobby chatter with any game system. Doesn't just have to be Warhammer the Old World, though there is a lot of Old World chatter going on there at the moment. I've got lots more videos like this planned. I've got a conversion stroke kitbash coming up for soon for another Bretonnian unit, and hopefully I'll get that done in the next few weeks. There's a little bit more painting involved in that one, and I will be painting many of the new miniatures as I get my hands on them. And if you're new to the channel and haven't seen already, there is quite a back catalogue of old world videos there where I've already painted a lot of the miniatures that are in those starter boxes as I've picked them up from eBay over the last year. If you would like to support the channel further, as I mentioned earlier, I do have a Patreon. The link to that is also in the video description. Go and have a little look at the different tiers there. The very basic tiers are very much just a little extra thanks, and the top tiers include some painting, tuition and coaching as well, with some of them giving you free dice. Don't forget to check out the channel sponsors Incom Gaming and Baron of Dice, and today's video sponsor Into the AM. You'll find links to all of those in the video description. Thank you very much for watching, take care, and I'll catch you soon.